Hello and happy 2017. I hope your 2016 was eventful and happy, and now you're excited to look back at all the books you read. I want to present to you my favourite 8 books of 2016. 8 for no better reason than these are the 8 that I think I enjoyed the most, that stuck with me, that I would recommend, and I think you should read 2017 if you haven't already. So let's just get into it. The first 2 books that I would like to recommend are by the same author, so it makes sense to mention them together. The author is Victoria Schwab, or V.E. Schwab, depending on whether or not you are emphasizing her more sort of younger audience books or her adult fiction, although maybe that distinction is unnecessary in the case of these 2 books. I enjoyed them both equally. The first book of hers I read was Vicious, which is about Victor and Eli, who were friends at university and together discovered a way to trigger supernatural abilities in humans, and the book then jumps forward, and Victor and Eli, once best friends, are now enemies. And the book is about them and why they are enemies and what they're fighting for, and a very colourful cast of X-Men-like sidekicks. And it was just so much fun. I just whizzed through it, and I recommend it to anyone who just likes a sort of fun, science fiction-y, poppy book. It was great. And the other book of Victoria Schwab's that I read in the last year was This Savage Song. This also, so I assume, is the first book in this case, a duology, I believe. It's set in a city where humans and monsters are at war, and we follow a boy and a girl who get to know each other and have to figure out which side they stand on. And the thing that I think was coolest about this world was, one, that it was just a very gritty urban setting, which was exceptionally well done. There are 3 different types of monsters, all with different characterizations and different ways in which they kill humans, basically, and also different ways in which these monsters appear in the first place, I guess. And I just thought that was a really cool idea, and it was really easy to imagine the whole setting. And there's really no good or bad, and all those different grey zones just made it really cool. So I really recommend both of those books. I'm trying to work my way up to my most favourite read of the last year, even though that's not quite as linear. The next book that I enjoyed much more than I thought I would was The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. This is a book that loads of people have read, especially sort of in their teenage years. It is a book about young German Liesel who goes to live with foster parents in a Second World War Germany. And it's about her relationships to her foster parents, to friends, to foes. Obviously, Nazi Germany is the setting, so that also heavily features in the storyline. It's not ignored, it is the main plot. And it's about how Liesel finds her love for reading and for books, which is a very beautiful story within the story. And I had never read the book before. I personally bawled my eyes out. There are also people who don't like the book. It is told from the point of view of death, which some people find gimmicky. I thought it worked, and I wasn't constantly reminded of that fact as a sort of stylized prose. I just felt for Lisa and all the other characters she gets to know. So I thought that was very emotional and powerful, and just a good solid story. The next book I would like to recommend, which I thought was excellently done, is a non-fiction book called So You've Been Publicly Shamed by Jon Ronson. This is the second of his books that I've read. The first was The Psychopath Test, which was also very well done. This one, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, I think I enjoyed even a bit more, just because I hadn't thought about the topic quite as much, so I enjoyed having sort of new input. It is basically about how we value and view public shaming. So in the era of internet, the small man now has the power to speak up, and there is a power in numbers when millions of people, maybe exaggerating, thousands of people, share something online and thus publicly shame someone who might have done something atrocious or slightly inconsiderate. There can be this huge shitstorm, basically. And I just really, really appreciated how Jon Ronson carefully researches these different examples and cases of public shaming, and you follow him as he tries to figure out what his stance is, if this is a positive or a negative thing, and how we can use or abuse public shaming as a tool. And I thought it was just very well done. He's so non-judgmental. He has obviously invested so much work in writing this book. And as was also the case with the psychopath test, he just writes in a very enjoyable way. So even though you're reading non-fiction, it's not work. You can easily, I read this within 2 or 3 days. You don't have to portion your way through it to understand it, or so I thoroughly enjoyed it. Then the other 4 books that I have that I would like to recommend, I gave all of these 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. Some I read earlier in the year, some I read later, so details of the storylines are not always quite as present. But I do remember the feeling that all of them gave me. The first one was The Yellowbirds by Kevin Powers, which was just a random pick because I thought the cover looked interesting and it was lying in my library. And this is told from the point of view from a soldier, John Bartle, and it's about his time in Iraq and his time coming back home and returning from the war. And the thing that stuck with me most was this the juxtaposition between the language that Kevin Powers uses, which is just so beautiful, and the horrendous things he talks about, and these horrible scenes of war and post-traumatic stress, and how somehow that works. Those two things, they work together, and they shouldn't, and it is still done with respect, and I thought it was an amazing read for me also because I don't tend to read a lot of war fiction. I'm always scared that it'll be either too judgmental or too nationalist. And those worries were totally unfounded for in this book. It was very powerful and emotional, and essentially that's what stays with me after finishing a book. The next book I would like to recommend was also just a library find called All the Birds Singing by Evie Wyld. I'm not sure if that's pronounced correctly. And this is a story about a female farmer somewhere on British land somewhere, and she discovers that one by one her sheep are getting killed by someone or something. And that could be a simple enough storyline, but that is chapter by chapter. We have that story going forward, and we have her past. That storyline travels backwards to her beginnings, basically, and why she's such a reclusive, almost asocial person living somewhere on a farm. She also has a dog, which that always gets another half point for me. And it was funny. I thought the character and the voice was very cynical, and I just liked her, even though she's not meant to be a specifically likable character. even though I didn't find myself being super interested in the revelation at the end and finding her beginning and what made her who she is, I could appreciate that there is this arc, and if you feel like you need a book with an end, then you get the satisfaction of having a sort of end for the character as well. And I just thought it was really surprising and unexpected. So I would definitely recommend that book. And then the second to last book I want to recommend, again, a library book, so I don't have nice physical books I can show you, was The Merman by Carl-Johan Vallgren. This book is about a young girl who is basically hustling to protect herself and her younger brother. They are abused and harassed in the most horrific ways, and that in itself was really, that book really packed a punch. And if you're sensitive to that, be warned. And if you, for some weird reason, like that kind of thing, and I do, it really makes you think and feel things. The Merman is about these two siblings and how they meet a merman. Basically, I don't want to say more because it's not important to know more about the plot. It is exceptionally well written. It's also a book in translation. It has been talked about before, and rightfully so, I think. Yeah, and the last book, the 8th book I would like to recommend, was actually the last book I read in the year 2016. So I haven't had much time to ponder whether I truly liked it, but it's also fresh in memory and I know that I liked it. It is My Grandmother Sends Her Regards and Apologises by Frederic Backman. This is also the author that wrote A Man Called O, which I also read and heavily enjoyed, and his signature is definitely present in this book. It is about a younger 7-year-old girl, yes, Elsa, and her grandmother dies and leaves a trail of letters for Elsa to find and to deliver to the recipients. And it's so lovingly done. All the characters are wonderful, all the relationships are relatable. The fairy tales that Elsa's grandmother used to tell her are intelligently interwoven with the characters that pop up throughout the book and that we get to know better. I have a grandmother who used to make up stories for me and tell them to me, and we would revisit the same characters from her stories, and that in itself just made this book so beautiful for me personally. And there are just a few scenes. I only have two markups, but they were just so powerful in interactions of the young girl Elsa with two side characters, a neighbour, Britt Marie, who I believe there's another book focusing more on her. So Frederic Backman wrote another book centered around Britt Marie, and that for sure is one of the next books I'm going to read. She is possibly one of my favourite characters because she's so multi-dimensional. And there's also the relationship between Elsa and her father. Her parents are divorced. There are just some so good moments. So please read it and tell me what you thought. So those are the 8 books that I enjoyed most in 2016. For the next year, I think I gotta learn that the library is just heaven sent. And it really pays off to just pick up books that you haven't heard of, that just feel right in the moment, because they all felt right. I hope you have a wonderful reading year ahead, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.